It was a Saturday, like many others, and James stood before the grave of his beloved wife, Alice. As usual, he brought white roses, his way of keeping her memory alive. But recently, something strange has started happening. Other flowers, not left by him, were appearing at her grave. They were fresh, always neatly placed, and James had no idea who was behind it. Determined to uncover the mystery, he arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual one weekend. While standing by the grave, deep in thought, a voice interrupted him. "Don't come back here anymore," a man said, placing a hand on his shoulder. James turned around, startled. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Let me explain," the man said, his voice heavy with emotion. James adjusted his collar for the 10th time, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The tired eyes that gazed back were filled with sorrow. His life had been a monotonous cycle of grief and guilt for the past 3 years since Alice had passed. With a deep breath, he grabbed his keys and left the house, preparing himself for another visit to the cemetery. His routine was always the same. He'd stop by the flower shop to pick up Alice's favorite, white roses. The shopkeeper, Danielle, always greeted him warmly, her kind smile contrasting with the sadness James carried. "Good morning, James," she said as he entered, already knowing what he was there for. "Morning, Danielle." "The usual, please." Danielle handed him the carefully wrapped bouquet. She often wondered about this man who seemed so loyal, yet so burdened with sadness. James thanked her and left, feeling her eyes on him as he walked out. At the cemetery, James placed the fresh roses by Alice's grave and sat beside it, lost in his thoughts. "Hi, Alice," he whispered. It had become a tradition to talk to her, even though she was no longer there to listen. The following week, things felt different. James entered the flower shop, and this time, Danielle noticed a deeper sadness in his eyes. "James, is everything okay?" she asked gently. He hesitated before responding. "Today marks 3 years," he said, his voice barely audible. Danielle stepped out from behind the counter and offered him a seat. "I'm so sorry, James. It must be so hard." He nodded, feeling the weight of his grief. "I don't know if it will ever get easier." "You can't blame yourself forever," Danielle said softly. Her insight caught James off guard. "But I do," he admitted. "I left when she needed me most." For the first time in years, James opened up about his past. He explained how his marriage had been in trouble, and when he was offered a year-long job abroad, Alice had begged him not to go. But he thought the time apart would help them, give them space to find each other again. The night before he left, Alice had told him in tears that she didn't think their marriage could survive if he chose work over her. Yet he left anyway, believing that he was doing what was best for them both. The year had been more difficult than he imagined. Communication between them dwindled, and when she did call, her words were cold, distant. James had convinced himself that once he returned, they'd be able to work things out. But on the day he was to come home, Alice was in an accident, never making it to the airport to meet him. "I should have stayed," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "If I hadn't left, she'd still be here." Danielle listened quietly, her heart aching for him. "You couldn't have known, James. It wasn't your fault." Over the next few weeks, something began to shift. James still visited Alice's grave, but he found himself spending more time at the flower shop, talking with Danielle. Their conversations gradually shifted from grief to lighter topics: books, small joys, and life's little wonders. Slowly, James began to feel a bit of warmth again, something that had been absent since Alice's death. But he couldn't shake the feeling that moving on would be a betrayal to Alice's memory. How could he love again when he still carried so much grief? One day, as James sat with Danielle, a conversation sparked a change. "Have you ever wondered why we choose certain flowers for different occasions?" James asked. Danielle smiled, explaining the symbolic meanings behind flowers. Roses for love, lilies for purity, chrysanthemums for honesty. James listened intently, unaware that time was slipping away. He suddenly realized he was late for his visit to the cemetery. "Sorry, I made you late," Danielle said, feeling guilty. "Don't worry," James replied. It was nice talking. That weekend, James arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual and finally spotted someone placing flowers at Alice's grave, a man he had never seen before. He approached him cautiously, "Excuse me, are you the one who's been leaving flowers here?" The man, who looked equally worn by life, nodded. "Yes, my name is Arthur." James frowned. "How did you know Alice?" Arthur hesitated before answering. "Alice and I were close. We met during the year you were away. She was struggling, and we became friends. Over time, it turned into something more." James felt his world shatter. She never told me. She respected you, James," Arthur said gently. "She wanted to talk to you face to face before making any decisions. That's why she was coming to the airport that day, to tell you that she wanted a divorce." James staggered, overwhelmed by the revelation. All these years, he had believed Alice was coming to reconcile, to save their marriage. The reality was far different. Arthur placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "She would want you to move on, James, to live your life." The following Saturday, James entered the flower shop and smiled at Danielle. "Actually, today I'd like something different," he said. "Different?" she asked, surprised. "Something colorful, something that represents a new beginning." Danielle's heart raced. "I have just the thing." As she prepared the bouquet, James took a deep breath. "Danielle, would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" Her eyes lit up with joy. "I'd love to, James." For the first time in 3 years, James felt free. He was no longer shackled by the past. He was ready to embrace the future.